Chapter 2. A very short history. There have been several attempts at writing a history of Western esotericism, and reliable historical introductions are available for each of its most important components. See Chapter 9. Since this guide for the perplexed takes a thematic and problem-oriented approach, we will restrict ourselves in this chapter to just a short overview of the basic historical currents and traditions that are indispensable for understanding the field, without any attempt at going into details. The goal is simply to provide a basic map of the terrain, as an initial means of orientation in what could otherwise be an extremely confusing field of exploration. Gnosis in Hellenistic culture. The origins of Western esotericism are in the Hellenistic culture of late antiquity, marked by complicated mixtures between Greek philosophy and indigenous religious traditions, especially those of the Egyptians. In the writings of many authors during the late Hellenistic period, Platonism was transformed into a religious worldview with its own mythologies and ritual practices, focused on the attainment of a salvational gnosis, knowledge, by which the human soul could be liberated from its material entanglement and regain its unity with the divine mind. Among thinkers of such a persuasion, it was widely assumed that Plato's philosophy was not an original product of Greek rational thinking but was grounded in the much more ancient religious wisdom traditions of the Oriental peoples, notably the Persians, the Egyptians, or the Hebrews. This widespread understanding of Platonism as religious wisdom from the East may be referred to as Platonic Orientalism, in contrast to Platonism understood as a tradition of Greek philosophical rationalism grounded in Socratic dialogue. The concern for a salvational gnosis in a broadly Platonic framework was widespread among thinkers whom we would now classify as Middle Platonists. Among its most important manifestations in view of the later history of Western esotericism is the Egyptian Hellenistic tradition known as Hermetism. 1. The name refers to a legendary and more or less divinized wisdom teacher, Hermes Trismegistus, originally a syncretic mixture of the Greek Hermes and the Egyptian Thoth, who was believed to have flourished in Egypt in very ancient times. The surviving texts attributed to Hermes, or in which he plays a central role, can in fact be dated to the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE. As far as the religious teachings of Hermetism are concerned, the most important of these texts are the so-called Corpus Hermeticum, 17 separate treatises collated together in medieval Byzantium, a larger work that has survived only in Latin, under the title Asclepius, and an initiatic text known as the Treatise of the 8th and the 9th, discovered only as recently as 1945. These texts contain technical discussions about the true nature of God, the world and man, but point out that philosophical discourse is just a preparation for religious salvation. The Hermetic devotee must transcend mere rational understanding and worldly attachments, to find salvation and ultimate release through being reborn, quite literally, in a spiritual body of immaterial light. This process of liberation and transformation culminates in spiritual ascent and, finally, blissful unity with the supreme powers of divine light. The material body and the sexual urges are obstacles that must be overcome to achieve this goal. But once the Hermetist has been reborn and his spiritual eyes are opened, he discovers that the divine is invisibly present throughout the whole of creation. Whether the Hermetic writings were a purely literary textual phenomenon or were used in actual communities, with a distinctive ritual practice, remains controversial among scholars. Whereas Hermetism was a product of pagan Egyptian Hellenism, the search for gnosis was widespread among Christians as well. The term was used in a positive sense by a few church fathers, notably Clement of Alexandria, but is mostly associated with the phenomenon known as Gnosticism. Under the influence of polemics by church fathers such as Irenaeus, Hippolytus or Epiphanius, who presented it as the heresy of heresies, Gnosticism has traditionally been perceived as a dualistic religion which taught that sparks of the divine light had become imprisoned in the world of matter and must escape from it, in order to find their way back to their divine source. According to basic Gnostic mythology, those human beings who carried the spark in themselves were rebelling against the demiurge, an ignorant or evil deity, often associated with the God of the Old Testament, who had created this lower world of darkness and ignorance as a prison for the soul, and therefore sought to prevent human beings from waking up to their true divine identity. By attaining gnosis, knowledge of their divine origin, Gnostics were set on their way to escape from the world of the demiurge and his demonic helpers, the archons, who would try to prevent them from rising up through the heavenly spheres after death and finding their way back to their divine home of light. After the sensational discovery of the so-called Nag Hammadi library in Egypt in 1945, which contained a whole range of previously unknown manuscripts, our picture of these Gnostic currents and their relation to Christianity has become much more complex than before. In contrast to the simple antithesis between theological orthodoxy and Gnostic dualistic heresy, the Gnostic religion, against the religion of the Church, scholars are now emphasizing that Christianity as such existed in many shades and varieties, including more or less Gnostic ones. Following that logic, some scholars are now arguing that the very term Gnosticism should better be discarded. Point 2. A third important trend in Hellenistic late antiquity is a ritual practice known as theurgy. Its earliest testimonies are the so-called Chaldean oracles, attributed to Julian the Theurgist, 2nd century CE, and it flourished in the philosophical milieu nowadays known as Neoplatonism. Theurgy remains rather mysterious in many respects, because the surviving sources do not tell us enough about how it worked exactly, but it clearly involved a ritual practice in which the gods were believed to manifest themselves and get in connection with the Neoplatonic practitioners. Iamblichus, the most central authority when it comes to theurgy, was at pains to emphasize that it involved neither a magical practice in which the gods are invoked or compelled to appear, nor a philosophical procedure based on the finite capacities of the human intellect. Instead, the theurgist performed unspeakable acts and worked with ineffable symbols that were understood by the gods alone, who then, by their own power, lifted the theurgist's mind up to the reality of the divine. Point 3. Like many other manifestations of the search for gnosis in late antiquity, notably Hermetism, theurgical union seems to have required the induction of unusual, ecstatic or trance-like states of consciousness through which the divine realities were believed to be experienced directly. The secrets of nature, magic, astrology, alchemy. Next to the search for spiritual salvation and knowledge of divine realities, Western esotericism involves the study of nature and its hidden or secret laws and dynamics. In modern secular culture, we are used to delegating these concerns to the separate spheres of religion and science, but in pre-Enlightenment contexts the boundaries were much more ambiguous and permeable. If nature has been created by God, or, more radically, has emanated from God's own being, then its secrets must somehow participate in the sphere of divinity as well, or at least mirror the mysteries of the divine economy. In Chapter 3, we will see how complex and controversial such notions could be. Often referred to by the problematic label, occult sciences, which we will be avoiding here, for the three most relevant domains in the study of nature are those of magic, astrology, and alchemy. Of these three, magic is the most difficult to grasp. The main reason is that in post-Enlightenment scholarship, countless authors have used it as a universal category pitted against religion and science. But from a historical point of view, this will not do. The famous magic, religion, science triad, pioneered by Edward Burnett Tylor and James Fraser, leads to gross simplification and anachronistic distortions if projected back onto the past. 5. And in the history of Western culture, magic has in fact a range of different and much more specific meanings. One of them is a direct legacy of Jewish and Christian polemics against pagan idolatry, in the wake of the first and second commandment. According to this understanding, all forms of magic are based upon contact with evil demons, who are none else than the old pagan deities that are still trying to deceive human beings, for example by posing as angels of light and promising them power in return for obedience and worship. The great wave of witchcraft persecutions in early modern Europe was grounded in such an understanding of demonic magic. More relevant to our present concerns, however, is the alternative concept of magia naturalis, natural magic. It emerged during the later Middle Ages in an attempt to demonstrate that many wondrous and miraculous phenomena attributed to demons by the common people could in fact be explained in purely natural terms. In other words, the concept of natural magic was an attempt to withdraw the study of nature from theological control by arguing that it had nothing to do with demonic intervention. Such a notion had become all but necessary because of the large-scale rediscovery, since around the 11th century, of the extensive literature on natural science from late antiquity. This intellectual tradition had been suppressed and neglected in Christian culture after the decline of the Roman Empire, but preserved by Islamic scholars, who had kept studying the sources while translating many of them from Greek into Arabic. A rich and vibrant intellectual culture had developed on the Spanish peninsula during the Middle Ages, and after the fall of Toledo in 1085, Christians gained access to the wealth of learning and scholarship preserved in the Superior Muslim libraries. Great numbers of manuscripts concerned with the ancient sciences were now translated from Arabic into Latin, and the result was a medieval, scientific revolution, with enormous consequences for the subsequent development of Western culture. One important part of magia naturalis was the study of so-called occult, lit. Hidden qualities, that is to say, of mysterious forces in nature such as magnetism or the influence of the moon on the tides, which could not be accounted for in terms of medieval science. Eventually the notion came to include invisible forces of all kinds, such as the influences radiating from the stars, the deformative powers attributed to the human imagination, or the evil eye. In principle, magia naturalis attempted to explain such phenomena in natural scientific terms, but in their very attempts to do so, scholars were giving credence to the reality of occult forces that were seen by others as supernatural and most likely demonic. From the latter perspective, the sciences of the Hellenistic world were a Trojan horse through which the demonic influence of paganism was once again allowed entrance into Christian culture. Hence, magic has always remained a deeply ambiguous category hovering between demonism and natural science. In sharp contrast to its post-Enlightenment reputation as an occult science or epitome of superstition, classical astrology was grounded in a concept of universal, immutable natural law. In Egypt, around the 2nd century BC, it had been developed into a rigorous causal model of cosmology that sought to explain all changes and effects in the sublunar world with reference to the eternally repeating rotations of the celestial bodies. It has therefore been described as the most comprehensive scientific theory of antiquity, which could use mathematical models in order to predict all possible changes in the world of cause and effect. 6 On the basis of Aristotelian natural philosophy, the assumption was that the sublunar world constituted of the 4 elements, earth, water, air, fire, was inert and incapable of moving by itself. The primi causae, first causes, of motion were the stars, which were endowed with life and intelligence and influenced the sublunar world through a subtle invisible medium known as the 5th element, quinta essentia. Alternatively, in terms of the ruling notion of as above, so below, the sublunar and supralunar worlds could be seen as corresponding with one another in terms of a pre-established harmony inherent in creation itself. Astrology was still widespread in pagan, Jewish and Christian milieus before Constantine, but as a divinatory art that suggested divinization of the heavenly bodies and a universal determinism that was seen as threatening the notion of free will, it was broadly dismissed and suppressed as pagan superstition until the later Middle Ages. From around the 11th century, the rediscovery of the ancient natural sciences preserved in Islamic culture, see above, led to a widespread Christian revival of astrology as indispensable to the new framework of magia naturalis. Particularly important in that respect is the notion of astral magic, the belief that powers and virtues from the stars can be channeled or drawn down by means of images or ritual techniques, for purposes of medical or psychological healing, but perhaps also to harmful ends. Astrology flourished during the Renaissance and remained an important dimension of natural science even during the period of the scientific revolution. But it was also part and parcel of the occult philosophy of the Renaissance, see below, with its many religious connotations and implications. As this occult philosophy lost the battle with Protestant and Enlightenment opponents during the 17th and 18th centuries, astrology entered a second period of decline during the 19th and the first half of the 20th. Astrology re-emerged after World War II in new and heavily psychologized forms, largely under the influence of Carl Gustav Jung and his theory of synchronicity. Western alchemy, finally, emerged during the late Hellenistic era as a laboratory practice concerned with the transmutation of material substances. On the basis of the 4 elements theory of Aristotelian natural philosophy, it should be possible in principle to change any substance into any other, including gold, and alchemists tried to discover the secrets of transmutation by experimental means. Already at an early stage, in the writings of Zosimos of Panopolis, technical descriptions of laboratory procedures were combined with vivid accounts of visions or dreams about initiatory processes of death and rebirth grounded in alchemical symbolism, suggesting that human beings could escape from gross materiality by being transmuted into spiritual beings. Like the other forms of Hellenistic science, alchemy was essentially forgotten during the early medieval period but rediscovered from Islamic sources during the later Middle Ages. Medieval and early modern alchemy is grounded in laboratory procedures pertaining to the domain of science or natural philosophy, but it so happened that its language of transmutation was a natural match for religious narratives about spiritual transformation and rebirth, suggesting that human beings can move beyond their material and sinful condition and attain a superior state of salvation and grace. From such perspectives, for example, Christ could be described metaphorically as the philosopher's stone, through whose action human beings were transmuted from gross materiality into spiritual gold. Such religious interpretations and adaptations grew in popularity after the Renaissance and flourished from the end of the 16th through the 17th century, whether in close connection with laboratory practice or entirely separate from it. As far as the history of science is concerned, it is practically impossible in this period to separate alchemy from what we would now see as chemistry, and hence the contemporary term chemistry has been proposed as a general label, next to chrysopoeia for alchemical attempts at making gold. 7 Like astrology, alchemy was expelled from official science during the 18th century and came to be perceived, very misleadingly, as mere pseudoscience or superstition during the 19th and much of the 20th century. After World War II, Jungian and traditionalist authors, see below, have sought to rehabilitate alchemy by downplaying its scientific nature in favor of its spiritual aspects, but such interpretations are esoteric rather than scholarly in nature. From the perspective of the study of Western esotericism, alchemy is best understood as a complex historical and cultural phenomenon that cannot be contained within any single discipline but is characterized by basic procedures of transmutation that may be pursued as science in laboratory settings and function as narratives in religious, philosophical, or even psychological discourse. The Renaissance. During the period of the Renaissance, a range of creative and influential thinkers took up the task of synthesizing ancient, pagan, learning and religious speculation with Christian thought, along with the newly discovered Jewish Kabbalah. In so doing, they created what has been called the basic referential corpus of Western esotericism. This phenomenon of intellectual innovation was essentially a side effect of military conquests and geopolitical changes involving the three religions of the book and, particularly, the shifting balance of power between Christianity and Islam. We have seen that the Christian conquest of the Spanish peninsula, with the fall of Toledo in 1085 as a pivotal event, led to a flood of translations from Arabic sources that revolutionized the natural sciences in the Latin West. 5 centuries later, the armies of the Ottoman Empire were advancing from the east, culminating in the conquest of Constantinople in 1453. In response to the political expansion of Islam, great numbers of ancient Greek manuscripts were brought from Byzantium to Italy. And on the Spanish peninsula, the Catholic monarchs Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon pursued a virulent anti-Jewish policy culminating in the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492. As a result of this pressure, many Spanish Kabbalists arrived in Italy during the later decades of the 15th century. In a nutshell, the phenomenon of Renaissance esotericism resulted from the willingness of Christian intellectuals to learn from all these newly available bodies of pagan and Jewish learning, and integrate their contents in what was and remained essentially a Roman Catholic theological and philosophical framework. The history of Renaissance esotericism is dominated by a core group of influential intellectuals, surrounded by much larger networks of lesser thinkers who adopted their ideas and developed them further. Among the indispensable names, the earliest one is the Byzantine philosopher George Gemistos, 1355–60, 1452, who came to call himself Plethin. He arrived in Florence in 1437, at the occasion of the Council of Ferrara and Florence, where the Eastern and Western churches were trying, unsuccessfully, to overcome their differences and unite against the threat of Islam. Plethin, who was already around 80 years old, was a living embodiment of what we have referred to as Platonic Orientalism, and impressed the Florentine humanists with his first-hand knowledge of Plato and Aristotle. He highlighted the Code of Theurgy, the Chaldean oracles, as a supreme example of the superior religion of the ancients that he believed had been inherited by the Platonists, and he claimed, incorrectly, of course, that they were written in very ancient times by none other than Zoroaster, the chief of the Persian Magi. This was the opening shot in a long history of Western fascination with Zoroaster, who came to be imagined as a supreme authority of ancient wisdom. 8. The second crucial figure is Marsilio Ficino, 1433–99, whose talents were discovered around 1460 by the ruler of Florence, Cosimo de' Medici. Cosimo had met Plethin during the time of the council, and had been impressed by his advocacy of Plato. A manuscript with Plato's complete dialogues had arrived from Byzantium in the meantime, and Ficino was ordered to translate them into Latin. The task was finished in 1468, and Ficino went on to summarize the essence of Plato's philosophy in a commentary on the symposium titled De More, presenting it as eminently compatible with Christian truth. With these and other seminal works, Ficino laid the groundwork for a large-scale Renaissance revival of Platonism, or more precisely, Platonic Orientalism. During the rest of his career, he translated a whole range of later Platonic authors as well, and published profound studies in which Platonism was presented as the key to Christian revival and renewal. Early on, during the early stages of his Plato translation, he also translated the Corpus Hermeticum, from an incomplete manuscript that contained its first 14 treatises. It was published in 1471, so that contemporaries now had direct access to what was believed to be the work of the most ancient Egyptian teacher of wisdom, Hermes Trismegistus. Ficino himself believed that the Persian Zoroaster, with his Chaldean oracles, was even older and hence more authoritative, but in his later work, notably his influential De Vita Coelitus Comparanda, he highlighted Hermes as a teacher of astral magic that could be used for the beneficent goals of medical and psychological healing. The remaining treatises of the Corpus Hermeticum were translated from another manuscript by Ficino's younger contemporary Lodovico Lazzarelli, 1447–1500, a minor but fascinating figure who also wrote a small masterpiece of Christian Hermetism that would become a major influence on the much more famous Cornelius Agrippa, see below. 9. But neither of these works became available during Lazzarelli's lifetime, and they were printed only during the first decade of the 16th century. In the wake of Ficino's pioneering work, countless authors began to pick up the notion of a profound inner unity between the ancient wisdom from the Orient, Platonic philosophy, and Christian theology. Prominent examples are the Vatican librarian Agostino Stucco, 1497–98, 1548, who published the fundamental Renaissance treatise on perennial philosophy in 1540, and Francesco Patrizzi, 1529-97, whose grand synthesis on Platonic Orientalist foundations, Nova de Universis Philosophia, New Philosophy of Everything, 1591, was condemned by the Vatican in 1594. The third crucial innovator next to Plethon and Ficino was Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, 1463-94. An intellectual prodigy, he created sensation in 1486 by inviting intellectuals from all over Europe to engage with him in public debate, presided over by the Pope, about no less than 900 theses written by him. The theses reflected Pico's wide-ranging familiarity with all the major traditions of learned speculation in philosophy, theology and science, including the ancient wisdom and, most innovatingly, the Jewish Kabbalah. But nothing ever came of the project. To Pico's alarm and disappointment, Pope Innocent VIII responded by censoring 13 theses and eventually condemning all of them, with special emphasis on those renovating the errors of pagan philosophers and those cherishing the deceits of the Jews. Pico's ambition had been to demonstrate that all the conflicts between the different philosophical and theological schools, including the systems of Platonism and Aristotelianism, could be resolved in a grand harmony of universal wisdom and truth. His project culminated in the sensational claim that all the fundamental truths of Christianity were already contained not only in the various traditions of the pagan nations, but, most surprisingly and controversially, in the secret tradition of Kabbalah that God had revealed to Moses at Mount Sinai. As a result, the true Christian tradition would rule supreme. Not only would the pagan sages be seen as bowing down symbolically before the truth of the gospel, but the Jews would have to convert quite literally, as it dawned on them that Jesus had been the true secret of their own ancient traditions all along. Pico's grand debate never took place, and even his famous opening speech, later known as the Oratio on the Dignity of Man, was never published during his lifetime. With prominent references to the Hermetic literature and emphasizing man's unique freedom to choose his own destiny, it has been hailed as an ultimate statement of the Renaissance mentality. Pico stands at the origin of at least two new, distinct but intimately related developments in Renaissance esotericism. One of them is the complex speculative tradition of number symbolism, not to be confused with numerology. Much indebted to Pythagoreanism, which assigns qualitative meanings or virtues to the first 10 decimals and interprets them as constitutive of reality in all its dimensions. The other is the Christian Kabbalah. In their efforts to understand the hidden dimensions of creation and scripture, Jewish Kabbalists had developed a range of specific and unique concepts and approaches, such as the system of 10 sphirot or divine manifestations, and exegetic techniques such as gematria, based on the assignment of numerical values to the Hebrew letters. Having adopted these elements into the framework of their own religion, Christian intellectuals now began to discover unexpected, sensational mysteries and hidden structures in their own scriptures, both the Old Testament and the New, as well as in the natural world around them. The chief pioneer of Christian Kabbalah after Pico was the German Johannes Reuchlin, 1455-1522, the most prominent Christian Hebraist of his day, whose De Arte Kabbalistica, 1517, has been called the Bible of the Christian Kabbalists. Among many later intellectuals involved in Christian Kabbalistic speculation, we might highlight the Frenchman Guillaume Postel, 1510-81, a linguistic virtuoso and messianic prophet who believed to have found the Messiah incarnated as a woman. The most impressive and influential attempt at integrating both the philosophical and the scientific traditions of antiquity within a comprehensive Christian Kabbalistic framework was published by the German Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, 1486-1535/36, under the title De Culta Philosophiae Libritrace, 1533. This work has long been seen as no more than a compendium or summa of all the available traditions of ancient learning, and has been plundered for information ever since, but it was much more than that. Agrippa's 3 books were dealing with the 3 worlds or domains of reality according to the prevailing Aristotelian and Ptolemaic system, which described the cosmos as a gigantic sphere. Our world was located in its center with the moon and the other planets circling around it, and the stars, including, of course, the astrological constellations, were fixed on the interior surface of the sphere. Agrippa's first book dealt with everything pertaining to our sublunar world constituted of the 4 elements. The second book was about the more abstract realities pertaining to the middle realm of the planetary spheres, between the moon and the fixed stars, and finally, the third book discussed the angelic and divine realities outside the cosmic globe. This last book was dominated entirely by Christian Kabbalah. Although posterity came to imagine Agrippa as a black magician in league with the devil, a model for Goethe's Faust, he was in fact an extremely pious Christian. Strongly influenced by Lazzarelli's Hermetism, his intention was to show a way of mystical ascent leading from the world of matter all the way up to unification with the divine intellect. 10 In his youth, Agrippa was strongly influenced by the abbot Johannes Trithemius, 1462-1516, a Renaissance pioneer of cryptography, demonology and angelic magic. And although Agrippa's own work was a theoretical treatise rather than a practical manual, it became an inspiration to occult practitioners working along similar lines. A notable example from a later generation is the Elizabethan magus John Dee, 1527 to 1609. He combined a strong focus on the natural sciences with an obsession for magical evocations by means of mediumistic trance, in which angelic beings were consulted about religious and philosophical as well as scientific matters. The Enochian language that he learned from the angelic sessions has fascinated occultists to the present day. Agrippa's great synthesis was still based upon the traditional geocentric cosmos, but due to the work of Copernicus, this closed world was beginning to give way, by the end of the 16th century, to the new vision of an infinite universe with an infinite number of solar systems. Since all the ancient sciences had been based upon the pre-Copernican model, this revolution was bound to have a major impact on Renaissance concerns with the traditions of antiquity. One can see this in exemplary fashion in the work of Giordano Bruno, 1548 to 1600, perhaps the most brilliant thinker among all the Renaissance figures discussed in this section. Bruno realized that if the universe is infinite, this must have enormous implications for God and his relation to man and the cosmos. Formulated simply, if someone had asked Agrippa where God is to be found, he would have pointed up to the sky, for just by moving upwards beyond the fixed stars one was bound to reach the metaphysical world of angelic and divine realities. In Bruno's post-Copernican universe, however, one could keep traveling through space for all eternity without ever meeting God or the angels. All one could expect to find was a never-ending series of further solar systems. Bruno's multifaceted oeuvre reflects a persistent and systematic attempt to rethink all the ancient philosophical and scientific traditions from the bottom up, next to other ones such as, notably, the so-called art of memory, particularly the system of the Catalan thinker Ramon Llull, 1232-33, 1316, and he did not stop at the sacred truths of Christian orthodoxy. Arrested by the Venetian Inquisition in 1592, then transferred to Rome, Bruno spent 8 years in prison and was finally burnt at the stake for heresy at the Campo dei Fiori in 1600. Naturphilosophie and Christian theosophy. The Renaissance thinkers discussed in the previous section were all highly erudite intellectuals, most of them Roman Catholics, engaged in the bookish project of synthesizing pagan and Jewish traditions with Christian theology and contemporary philosophy or science. Essentially, we are dealing with a tradition of learned commentaries on the writings of ancient and authoritative thinkers. Figures as independent as Bruno or, to a lesser extent, John Dee, are already less typical of this phenomenon, and could be seen as boundary cases in relation to the category we are now about to discuss. Whereas the former movement had its intellectual and geographical center in Italy, this one is very much dominated by German thinkers. The emphasis shifts from learned commentaries on ancient and venerable authorities to original speculations, legitimated by references to the author's own, direct individual experience. Although speculative traditions derived from late antiquity and medieval Kabbalah continue to be important in this new genre, it refers much more explicitly to only two basic sources of authority: the two books of nature and Holy Scripture. As could be expected, given this emphasis on the Bible and the centrality of German culture, the emphasis in this lineage shifts from Roman Catholics to Protestant, mostly Lutheran, authors. The German term Naturphilosophie is usually preferred over its literal equivalent in English, because the latter, philosophy of nature, could as well refer to all kinds of other approaches that have little to do with the specific tradition under discussion here. Without any doubt, its foundational author is the German physician Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, 1493-94, 1541, who called himself Paracelsus. Taking inspiration from alchemical literature as well as close personal acquaintance with traditional folk healing methods, he attacked the contemporary medical establishment and its blind reliance of the theories of Galen, 2nd century. Instead, physicians should learn directly from nature herself, by means of personal experiment. Paracelsus introduced a whole new medical terminology, complementing the four elements with a new triad of mercury, sulfur, and salt. Paracelsus' later works were increasingly concerned with religious questions. Writing in German instead of the Latin of the intellectual elites, he has been called the Luther of medicine, and it is true that he instigated a reformation all of his own. With countless adherents during the 16th and 17th centuries, the Paracelsian tradition, also known as the chemical philosophy, spread beyond Germany to France and England, and became a major force of innovation in medicine and alchemy/chemistry, see above. The development of Western esotericism in the early modern period is unthinkable without it. Apart from science and medicine, Paracelsian thought became essential in more strictly religious contexts as well. From around 1600 it developed into an alternative religious current in conflict with the established churches, sometimes known as Theophrastia Sancta, but eventually known as Weigelianism, with reference to the dissenter Valentin Weigel, 1533–88. Point 11 Paracelsus himself was cast in the role of a divinely inspired seer who had revived a kind of perennial tradition that had been practiced by the apostles. It is from a rather similar perspective that in the first decades of the 17th century, the German cobbler Jacob Boehme, 1575–1624, wrote an oeuvre of impressive depth and originality that has become foundational for one of the major currents in the history of Western esotericism, Christian theosophy. In a heartfelt attempt to understand how a good God could have created a world so full of evil and suffering, Boehme developed a dramatic visionary cosmogony filled with alchemical and Paracelsian references that described the birth of God himself out of the unfathomable mystery of the ungrund. Referred to as eternal nature, God's body was imagined as a luminous substance, constituted of a dark and wrathful core, associated with God the Father, redeemed and rendered harmless by the complementary forces of light and love, associated with God the Son. Lucifer, the greatest of the angels, was born as a perfect creature of light in the body of eternal nature, but in an attempt to rise even higher by achieving his own rebirth, he turned into a creature of darkness and destroyed the integrity and harmony of the world of light. As the result of Lucifer's fall, our own world came into being. No longer eternal nature, but a fallen nature subjected to time and change, in which the dark wrath of the Godhead is unleashed as a separate force in mortal combat with the power of light. Our spiritual calling as sinful human beings born in this dark and threatening world is to achieve an inner transformation, which reverses the process of the fall and mirrors the primordial birth of God himself. By doing so, we are literally reborn as the Son of God in a subtle body of light, and contribute to the reintegration of fallen nature. God's own body that is yearning to return to its original state of harmony and bliss. Written in a strange German full of flashes of poetic vision, Boehme's works were widely disseminated already during his lifetime, and caused him much trouble with the Lutheran authorities. Later during the 17th century, many authors took inspiration from Boehme's work and developed it into new directions. Some of them formed small spiritual communities, the first clear examples of what might be called esoteric organizations, with devotional practices of their own. Thus the German theosopher Johann Georg Gichtel, 1638–1710, formed a group called the Angelic Brethren, in Amsterdam, and in England a Philadelphian society, formed around John Portage, 1607–0881, and Jane Lead, 1623–1704, perhaps the earliest example in Western esotericism of a woman playing a central role. Ecstatic and visionary experiences played an important part in these communities, and based upon discussions in Boehme, their members developed a strong fascination with the figure of Sophia, wisdom, as an explicitly feminine manifestation of divinity. After a transitional period during the 18th century, with Friedrich Christoph Oedinger, 1702–82, as the most important figure, Christian theosophy entered its second golden age from the final decades of the 18th century through the Romantic era. The Frenchman Louis Claude de Saint-Martin, 1743–1803, the unknown philosopher, and the German Franz von Baader, 1765–1841, were perhaps the most important thinkers in an emerging network of Christian theosophers who rediscovered Boehme and interpreted him in new ways, partly under the influence of contemporary developments such as German idealist philosophy and the vogue of mesmerism, see below. Initiatic societies. The belief that ancient wisdom or the secrets of nature had been transmitted and kept alive by wise men through the ages belongs to the central tenets of Western esotericism. Remarkably, however, that such a transmission might require some kind of formal organization does not seem to have occurred to anyone before the 17th century. The idea emerges in the first of the three so-called Rosicrucian manifestos, published in 1614. This text, known as the Fama Fraternitatis, describes a mysterious brotherhood founded by an equally elusive adept called Cr, later identified as Christian Rosenkreuz. After travels through the Middle East and profound studies of the occult sciences, the Fama tells us, he had returned to Germany where he founded a secret organization that would ensure that his supreme wisdom would not get lost. At one point the members decided to spread through all countries while keeping their brotherhood a secret, but each of them promised to find a suitable successor who would carry their wisdom on to the next generation, and so on. After 100 years had passed, a member of the brotherhood is said to have discovered a secret crypt in Christian Rosenkreuz's house, containing his perfectly preserved body and secret information of all kinds. The brotherhood now announced its existence to the general public by means of the Fama Fraternitatis, followed by a Confessio Fraternitatis in 1615, predicting a new reformation that would transform European culture along the lines of the ancient Hermetic and related sciences. A third manifesto, published in 1616, was quite different in nature. Called The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz, it was a complex allegorical account of Christian transformation based upon alchemical symbolism. Its protagonist was Christian Rosenkreuz, but the Brotherhood played no role in it. There is no evidence that any Rosicrucian Brotherhood really existed at this time or before, let alone that Christian Rosenkreutz was a historical personality. The manifestos are now generally seen as a literary invention, attributed to the Lutheran theologian Johann Valentin Andrea, 1586–1654, and his circle of friends in Tübingen. But they made a great impression on many readers, resulting in a stunning amount of public responses, whether from critics who denounced the Brotherhood as a hoax or defenders and true believers who would like to contact its members. As one effect of this furor, important authors in the field of ancient wisdom and the occult sciences, such as Robert Flood, 1574–1637, or Michael Meyer, 1569–1622, began to identify themselves as Rosicrucians, and authors claiming special esoteric knowledge have kept doing so ever since. Some marginal groups concerned with alchemy or other occult practices may have begun calling themselves Rosicrucian during the later 17th century or the first half of the 18th, but the evidence is vague and ambiguous. The first irrefutable case of a Rosicrucian organization is the Order of the Gold, UND Rosenkreutzer, which flourished in Germany in the second half of the 18th century. After that period, as the increasing separation of church and state now made it possible to create religious or initiatic organizations next to the established churches, many initiatic organizations have come into existence that think of themselves as Rosicrucian and usually claim to preserve the true secrets of the ancient wisdom. The ritual and organizational frameworks of such initiatic orders have been inspired, in most cases, by models derived from Freemasonry. In Scotland by the end of the 16th century, the medieval guilds of stonemasons were transformed into a new kind of organization that began to accept gentlemen masons, individuals who were not Masonic craftsmen, during the 17th century. Up to the first decades of the 18th century, Freemasons were widely perceived as Rosicrucians and practitioners of alchemy, and the Brotherhood attracted much curiosity because of suspicions that it might have preserved the mysterious secrets of antiquity, including that of the Philosopher's Stone. In England, Freemasonry distanced itself from such esoteric pursuits as it developed into an essentially rationalist and humanitarian movement after the foundation of the premier Grand Lodge of England in 1717. But in other countries, notably France, the concern with alchemical and other hermetic ideas and practices flourished as never before. After having been initiated into the three basic Masonic grades of apprentice, fellowcraft, and master mason, Masons could progress deeper into the Masonic mysteries through elaborate systems of higher grades. As many different higher degree systems were developed during the later 18th century, joining Freemasonry became the logical thing to do for anybody fascinated by hidden mysteries and the secrets of the ancients. The flowering of Christian theosophy in high-degree Masonic systems during the Age of Reason, see especially Jean-Baptiste Willermaz, Rectified Scottish Rite, and its backgrounds in Martinez de Pasquale's Elus Cones, is known as Illuminism. Since the prevailing class system was suspended within the lodge, a member of the upper nobility might well receive his initiation from a master belonging to the working class. Freemasonry was also highly attractive as a context where one could experiment with socially egalitarian ideas. And finally, it functioned as an effective international network, which assured that travelers far from home could always find a place where they would be welcomed by their fellow brethren. Since all this made Freemasonry into something like a society within public society, protected from outside scrutiny by its cultivation of secrecy, it was bound to evoke suspicions from the political rulers, and in a few cases, notably Adam Weishaupt's Order of Illuminates, a vehicle for radical revolutionary politics, such concerns were indeed justified. Particularly after the French Revolution, Freemasonry has become a favorite target of conspiracy theorists who attributed the breakdown of traditional religious and political authority to the subversive machinations of Masons and Illuminati. From the beginning, Freemasons were concerned with creating a historical pedigree for their organization. Sometimes the institution of Freemasonry was traced as far back as Noah and his sons after the flood, but Masons developed a particular fascination with speculative historical lineages that connected the ancient sects of the Essenes and Therapeutae to the medieval Knights Templar. Masonic ritual is grounded in architectural symbolism, with a central role for Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem as the image of the perfect building, so it was natural for Freemasons to develop a special interest in the chivalric order that had been charged with its defense. The idea was that during the times of the Crusades, Templar Knights in the Holy Land had established contact with surviving branches of the Essenes/Therapeutae, who had preserved the ancient secrets from the Orient, including the supreme Pythagorean art of geometry. After the dissolution of the order in 1307, surviving Templars were believed to have brought its secrets to Scotland, often considered the homeland of Freemasonry. This is the origin of the influential Templar legend, which has led not only to special Templar degrees within Freemasonry, but eventually also to non-Masonic Neo-Templar organizations up to the present day. Not to mention a burgeoning Templar mythology in popular literature from Umberto Eco to Dan Brown. The modernist occult. With the media revolution of the 18th century and the dwindling ability of church and state to censor or prohibit dissenting voices, all the bodies of traditional literature discussed above became available to larger and larger audiences. Next to a stream of skeptical literature that dismissed the occult as ridiculous superstition, publishing entrepreneurs catered to the public's curiosity about ancient secrets and mysteries. The modernist occult is marked by complex and multifaceted attempts at coming to terms with modern science and Enlightenment rationality, combining a deeply felt resistance against the disenchantment of the world with an equally strong attraction to modern scientific models. As Europeans and Americans entered the 19th century, nobody could deny that society was moving with accelerating speed into new directions, and thus the question became relevant of whether progress meant a radical break with tradition or, rather, entailed a transformation that allowed ancient truths to be perceived in a new light. It is no coincidence, then, that the two most influential forces of innovation in Western esotericism during the 19th century had their origins in the work of Enlightenment scientists. The Swedish naturalist Emanuel Swedenborg, 1688 to 1772, studied philosophy, mathematics, physics and applied mechanics and went on to produce an impressive oeuvre in the physical and organic sciences. Trained in the Cartesian philosophy of his day, with its strict separation between matter and spirit, he experienced a deep religious crisis in 1744. Forced to admit to himself that his scientific explorations led him to the abyss of pure materialism, he prayed to God for help and was granted a vision of Christ. After this pivotal event, he spent the rest of his life writing visionary works, in Latin, on the true meaning of the Bible and the spiritual realities of heaven and hell. Deeply influenced by pietist concepts of internal versus external levels of reality, his theory of correspondences claimed that the visible world mirrors the invisible one without any need for causal relations between the two, and his works were filled with matter-of-fact descriptions of his visionary travels to heaven and hell and his conversations with spirits and angels. While followers created a Swedenborgian new church after his death, the influence of Swedenborg's writings is by no means limited to that community. They have inspired a wide range of major writers, poets, painters and even composers, and its basic ideas were picked up and developed in new directions, as will be seen, by spiritualist, occultist and metaphysical authors and practitioners during the 19th and 20th centuries. The second major innovation came from a German physician, Franz Anton Mesmer, 1734 to 1815, who invented a theory and practice of healing known as animal magnetism, later also known as mesmerism. Mesmer claimed that an invisible fluid permeated all organic bodies, and all illnesses were caused by disturbances or blockages in the flow of this universal life force. By making passes over the patient's body, the normal circulation of energy could be restored, and the resulting transition to health and normality was typically marked by a short but violent crisis in which the patient made uncontrollable movements and sounds. One of Mesmer's many followers, a Marquis de Peisger, discovered that mesmeric treatment could induce a strange condition of sleep-like trance, in which many patients displayed remarkable paranormal abilities and entered visionary states in which they claimed to communicate with spiritual beings on other levels of reality. This phenomenon, known as artificial somnambulism, has exerted an incalculable influence on the history of Western esotericism during the 19th century. No less than three major new developments have their origin in mesmerism. First, somnambulist trance became central to the vogue of spiritualism. In the wake of a media hype in 1848, around the Fox sisters in Hydesville, who claimed to be in contact with a poltergeist, spiritualist seances became a popular pastime in America and Europe. The technique of somnambulic trance induction now made it possible for any citizen to satisfy his or her curiosity about the invisible world and survival after death without any need for mediation by the church. Much of spiritualism was a practical affair with little theoretical depth, but influential authors such as Andrew Jackson Davis, 1826 to 1910, who was strongly influenced by Swedenborg's writings, or the French spiritualist Allan Kardec, P.S. of Hippolyte Rivail, 1804 to 69, whose work has become a major religious tradition in Brazil, developed full-blown theologies and cosmologies on spiritualist foundations. Scientific curiosity about the phenomena and spectacular claims of spiritualism, finally, led to the development of psychical research or what would now be referred to as parapsychology. Secondly, artificial somnambulism is at the origin of the new disciplines of psychology and psychiatry, as physicians were quick to realize that it opened up unheard-of possibilities for studying the human soul and its mysterious powers on an empirical and experimental basis. The concept that we now refer to as the unconscious emerged in the literature of German Romantic mesmerism during the first half of the 19th century, originally under the label of the night side of nature, and the development of psychological investigation based on somnambulism can be traced in straight lines from there to the experimental psychology of Charcot, Flournoy and others, and finally to Carl Gustav Jung and his school. In all these developments, psychology was inextricably entwined with study of the occult. It is only during the 20th century, with the rise of psychoanalysis and behaviorism, that academic psychology distanced itself from its deep historical involvement with Western esotericism. Thirdly and finally, the American career of artificial somnambulism led to a widespread milieu of religious innovation known as New Thought, based upon a radical doctrine of mind over matter. This development had its origin in the work of a mesmerist called Phineas P. Quimby, 1802-66, who abandoned Mesmer's fluidic theory as the explanation for somnambulic healing in favor of a radical emphasis on the universal and omnipotent power of belief. Eventually, it was claimed that not only all forms of illness could be cured by means of changing one's beliefs, but other negative conditions, such as poverty, as well. Also known as mind cure, the basic doctrines of New Thought have been institutionalized in new religions, such as Christian Science and a series of similar churches, and they have become deeply ingrained in American popular culture. In contemporary, New Age contexts, this development is basic not only to an endless series of self-help books but also to the widespread claim that we literally create our own reality by means of our beliefs. During the second half of the 19th century, all the ancient, medieval and Renaissance traditions discussed above were rediscovered and reconceptualized by groups and individuals who had been influenced by spiritualist and somnambulist practice and tried to find a third way between traditional Christianity and positivist science. This phenomenon is usually referred to as occultism, and it comes in different forms. The occultism of the Rite 12 that was dominant in France was very strongly influenced by Roman Catholicism. It was frequented by countless abbés, pretended or real, who were trying to come to terms with the legacy of the Revolution and its sensationally successful assault on the traditional authority of altar and throne. Politically, their approaches varied from deeply conservative to progressive, but they all shared an obsessive nostalgia for the lost unity of a universal tradition that had expressed itself by means of spiritual symbolism. Among the most important figures, representing successive generations in French occultism, are Eliphas Levi, P.S. of Alphonse Louis Constant, 1810-75, whose works on magic and Kabbalah were highly influential within the occultist revival, and Papoose, P.S. of Gerardin Cos, 1865-1916, the Pope of Occultism, who played a central role in a whole range of occultist organizations and networks that flourished during the fin de siècle and left important traces in the art, literature, and music of that period. This concern of French occultists with tradition found its most extreme expression in the work of René Guénon, 1886-1951. During his younger years he was deeply involved in a range of occultist organizations, but he finally rejected all of them as misguided products of compromise with modernity. Guénon claimed the existence of one single, universal tradition, based on metaphysical first principles that were beyond any critical debate or refutation. He rejected the modern world and all its values as the absolute antithesis of tradition, and spent the last decades of his life as a Sufi recluse in Egypt. Guénon's many writings are at the origin of an independent esoteric tradition known as traditionalism, sometimes perennialism. In its very rejection of modernity in all its aspects, it is, ironically, a typical product of the modern world. In cases such as the major traditionalist author Julius Evola, 1898-1974, contempt for modern democracy and social egalitarianism led to open sympathy for fascist and national socialist politics. In other cases, such as that of Frithjof Schuon, 1907-98, perhaps the most influential traditionalist after World War II, it inspired the creation of new organizations and communities that allowed its participants to follow traditionalist lifestyles in relative seclusion. Yet other post-war traditionalists, such as notably Said Hossein Nasr, born in 1933, and Houston Smith, born in 1919, have been vocal defenders of traditionalism in academic settings. In contrast to 19th century France, the Anglophone world was characterized rather by an occultism of the left, strongly indebted to anti-Christian mythographical traditions grounded in the work of Enlightenment libertines who had argued that religion had its origin not in divine revelation but in a natural religion of solar worship and phallicism. 13 The occult tradition came to be perceived as an ancient and superior wisdom grounded in pagan traditions opposed to the exclusivism and dogmatism of established Christianity. Erstwhile spiritualist mediums such as Emma Hardinge Britten, 1823-99, and Helena P. Blavatsky, 1831-91, had become disillusioned with what they saw as the superficiality of spiritualism, and found inspiration in all the major Hermetic, occult, and related traditions prior to Swedenborg. In their view, the universal occult science of the ancients, both East and West, should be revived against the narrow materialism of positivist science. The major classic of this new approach was Blavatsky's Isis Unveiled, 1877, later followed by The Secret Doctrine, 1888, in which the sources of occult wisdom were moved from Egypt to the Far East. Blavatsky presented occult science as the central, ancient, and universal tradition of superior knowledge and wisdom that should be revived, in the modern world, as an alternative to traditional Christianity and positivist science. In 1875, she co-founded the Theosophical Society, which became the most influential occultist organization at least up to the 1930s. Under the leadership of Annie Besant, 1847 to 1933, and Charles Webster Leadbeater, 1854 to 1934, modern theosophy was reinterpreted increasingly in terms of an ecumenical esoteric Christianity, culminating in a long phase of messianic fervor around the Indian Jiddu Krishnamurti, 1895 to 1986, who was raised as the coming world teacher, but finally rejected that role in 1929. Largely in response to the Krishnamurti cult, most of the German theosophists under the leadership of Rudolf Steiner, 1861 to 1925, broke away from theosophy in the 1910s. The resulting Anthroposophical Society was based upon a Christian interpretation of theosophy bolstered by Steiner's claims of superior clairvoyant access to the spiritual world, against a background of philosophy in the German idealist tradition. Magical traditions had been reduced to mere objects of antiquarian curiosity by the mid-19th century, but occultists began to cultivate magical practice in the decades thereafter. The result was an entirely new understanding of magic, claiming ancient roots but in fact based on highly innovative concepts and interpretations. An important pioneer was the American Paschal Beverly Randolph, 1825 to 75, who was the first to argue that sexual energy and psychoactive drugs could be harnessed to magical ends. In England by the end of the 19th century, an initiatic order called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn cultivated an elaborate and sophisticated system of symbolism and ritual practice, based upon the Kabbalistic system of the Sphirot, that has become a major source of inspiration for many magical groups up to the present. The most notorious occultist magician of the 20th century, Aleister Crowley, 1875 to 1947, broke away from the Golden Dawn and went on to join Theodore Roos's Ordo Templi Orientis, which eventually developed under his leadership into an order with a strong emphasis on sexual magic. His self-stylization as the great beast of the apocalypse, whose new religion, Thelema, was destined to supplant Christianity, and his systematic experimentation with every conceivable form of transgression, has made Crowley controversial even among occultists. But the impact of his writings has been enormous. In many respects, these organizations and many similar ones that flourished before World War II can be seen as attempts to compensate for the prosaic world of disenchanted society by cultivating the powers of the imagination as a means of experiential access to parallel realities of magical enchantment. Ultimately, the focus in these contexts is more on individual, inner development of the magician than on influencing events in the outside world. This means that the very concept of magic acquires new shades of meaning, particularly under the impact of popular psychology. With regard to the focus on inner development in an esoteric context, but now without overt reference to magic, mention must finally be made of the enigmatic Greco-Armenian teacher George Ivanovich Gurdjieff, 1866 to 1949, and his Russian pupil Pyotr Demyanovich Ouspensky, 1878 to 1947. Gurdjieff developed an independent and original esoteric system that includes a neo-Gnostic cosmology and a complicated training system for liberating the mind from social control and attaining spiritual freedom. Gurdjieffian techniques were adopted by various esoteric teachers and movements after World War II, and have become an important dimension of the post-1960s concern with self-realization. Esotericism after World War II. Most of the esoteric activities mentioned in the previous section are aspects of what has been called the cultic milieu 14 or, more recently, a culture point 15. These terms refer to what appears to have become a constant phenomenon in modern and contemporary society: the existence of interlocking, continually fluctuating and evolving networks of groups and individuals who share a dissatisfaction with the approaches to reality, knowledge and lifestyle that are promoted by mainstream educational institutions and channels of information. The search for alternatives results not only in widespread fascination with non-Western, particularly Oriental, cultures and their spiritual traditions, but also in a continuous process of recycling, repackaging and creative reinterpretation of more or less all the esoteric and occultist materials that have implicitly been categorized as rejected knowledge by the dominant culture. The post-war cultic milieu developed during the 1950s and became impossible to deny with the emergence of the so-called counterculture of the 1960s and 1970s. As esoteric ideas and practices became more and more fashionable in wider society, its adherents came to see themselves as participating in a spiritual revolution that was transforming the dominant culture and would lead humanity into a new spiritual era, the Age of Aquarius. This millenarian idea of an imminent spiritual revolution had emerged in specific theosophical circles in England, associated with the writings of Alice Bailey, 1880 to 1949, but by the 1980s, the term New Age was picked up by the mainstream media as a convenient label for the full spread of alternative ideas and practices ingrained in the cultic milieu, whether or not they included a millenarian component. Next to Western esoteric/occultist currents and Oriental spiritualities, popular fascination with the new physics was an important part of the mix as well, as the radical paradoxes of quantum mechanics and relativity theory seemed to confirm that the old scientific ideologies were in the process of breaking down together with the established religions, thus making way for a new spiritual and holistic worldview in harmony with the ancient wisdom of the East and West. As business entrepreneurs discovered the market for spiritual products during the same period, the New Age became a major growth industry. And as an inevitable result of commercial success, its ideas have gradually become more acceptable in mainstream society than they were in the 1960s. Nevertheless, the original countercultural critique of mainstream culture, including strong belief in an imminent transformation of society, remains very much alive in the more radical branches of the cultic milieu. One sees this especially in the techno-shamanism since the 1990s, which has its origins in the psychedelic shamanism promoted in the wake of Carlos Castaneda, but without the anti-technological bias of the 1960s. The pioneer of this radical countercultural form of entheogenic esotericism was Terence McKenna, 1946 to 2000, and with new generation prophets such as Daniel Pinchbeck, born in 1966, it has developed into a vibrant esoteric milieu full of millenarian hopes for an imminent transformation of society. A special and relatively separate outcome of the 1960s counterculture is the movement known as neopaganism. It originated in England, with a new religion created in the 1950s by Gerald Gardner, 1864 to 1964, but presented by him as the revival of an underground cult of pagan nature worship. Referred to as Wicca, or the old religion of witchcraft, it combined occultism in the tradition of Aleister Crowley with a fascination for ancient fertility cults. Wicca spread to the United States during the 1960s, where it took on new forms in the countercultural milieu. Radical feminist activists such as Starhawk, P.S. of Miriam Simos, born in 1951, and others interpreted Wicca as goddess religion, emphasizing the female principle in nature as an alternative to the male deity of monotheism. From this period on, neopaganism has developed into a whole series of new directions based upon attempts to revive specific regional pagan traditions, such as Druidry and similar forms of Celtic revivalism, or neo-pagan movements such as Asatru that take inspiration from the ancient Germanic and Scandinavian pantheons. Today, neopaganism exists in many countries as a vital subculture that celebrates diversity and emphasizes natural and ecological lifestyles. Finally, contemporary esotericism is very much alive in popular culture and on the internet. Its basic concepts, ideas or terminologies are now no longer tied to any specific religious or intellectual tradition, but can be freely recycled and reinterpreted by anybody, without regard for their original meaning or context. No matter how bizarre and mistaken such adaptations may be from the perspective of the historian, they can be fascinating if seen as products of creative syncretism. The overwhelming presence of esoteric motifs in popular novels, comics, music, film, art, or video gaming has hardly yet been researched at all. Nor do we have any idea of what this wealth of references could teach us about the sub-zeitgeist 17 of contemporary culture and society. It is in this domain that esotericism ceases to be an object of historical research altogether, and becomes a vital dimension of the very present.